Silas Thorne was mending a hole in his perpetually leaking roof, a task as familiar and futile as breathing. The rain had a personal vendetta against his small corner of the world, and every shingle he replaced seemed to invite a new leak to spring forth in defiance. He was a man made of weary sighs and the quiet ache of poverty, his bones thin and his spirit worn smooth by hardship. He knew the rules of the town of Oakhaven, rules written in stone and fear. Rule 1. Mind your own business. Don't look at the troubles of others, lest they become your own. Rule 2. Pay your debts to Howell Critch. The town magistrate's ledger was a more powerful god than any whispered about in the old temples, and his judgment was swift and merciless. And then there was the third, the most important rule of all, the one carved into the very soul of the borderlands. Never, ever trust an orc. They were monsters, savages, the ancient enemy. But when he stumbled through the dripping woods that evening, searching for fallen branches for his near-empty hearth, he found her. An orc, impossibly large and caught in the rusted jaws of a bear trap someone had left forgotten for years. She was bleeding, exhausted, her formidable strength sapped, and her green skin pale in the twilight. Tucked behind her, shielded by her body, was a small orc child, his eyes wide with terror. In that moment, seeing a warrior brought low and a child trembling in fear, Silas Thorne broke the most important rule of all, and that choice, made in the damp silence of the woods, changed everything. The air was thick with the smell of rain on dust and the metallic tang of blood. The orc female, Gaza, he would later learn, was a study in broken power. Her muscles, corded and thick enough to snap a man's spine, were trembling with exhaustion. A deep, ragged gash on her thigh, where the trap's teeth had sunk deep, oozed dark blood onto the mulchy ground. She held a broken shard of a spear in one hand, the point wavering but still aimed at his heart. Her defiance was a flickering candle in a hurricane. "Go, human," she rasped, the words in the common tongue rough and strained, like stones grinding together. "This is not your fight." Silas looked from her pain-filled eyes to the small boy hiding behind her. He couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 in human years, his face a mask of tear-streaked dirt and sheer terror. Silas's heart, a thing he usually kept guarded and still, gave a painful lurch. He saw not a monster, but a mother, a protector. He saw the same desperate fear he felt every time Howell Critch's shadow fell across his doorway. He held up his empty hands, showing he meant no harm. His own weariness was a heavy cloak on his shoulders. "The trap," he said, his voice quiet, almost lost in the drip of water from the leaves. "It's old, rusted. I can help." Her eyes narrowed with suspicion. Trust was not a currency her people traded in, especially not with humans. To her, he was the enemy, a creature of soft flesh and cunning cruelty. "Why?" she growled, the single word a demand, a challenge, a plea. Silas didn't have a grand answer. He didn't have a speech about honor or unity. He just had the image of the child's face and the memory of his own mother, her face etched with a similar worry, before the sickness took her. "Because no one should die in a forgotten trap in the woods," he said simply. He took a cautious step forward. "Because he is afraid." He nodded toward the boy. That seemed to pierce her armor. Her gaze softened for a fraction of a second as she glanced back at the child, a silent promise passing between them. She gave a short, sharp nod, permission. Getting her free was a nightmare of rusted metal and suppressed pain. Silas's hands, accustomed to mending shingles and darning socks, were not made for this. He had a small wood axe and a pry bar he used for stubborn roots. He worked carefully, his knuckles scraping against the iron, the smell of her blood making him feel faint. She never cried out, not once. She just grit her teeth, her knuckles white on the spear shard, her breathing a harsh, controlled rhythm. The little boy, Mock, watched with wide, unblinking eyes, a silent statue of fear. Finally, with a groan of protesting metal and a squelch that made Silas's stomach turn, the jaws of the trap sprang open. Gaza collapsed onto her side, her wounded leg buckling. The immediate danger was past, but a new one presented itself. She was weak, bleeding, and the chill of the evening was setting in. Leaving them here was a death sentence. The wolves, or worse, a human patrol, would find them before morning. The rules screamed in his head. Mind your own business. Never trust an orc. His hovel was barely a shelter for one. His larder held half a loaf of stale bread and a few wrinkled potatoes. Taking them in was madness. It was suicide. Hal Critch would have him flogged for vagrancy if he found out, or hanged for treason. He looked at Gaza, who was trying and failing to push herself up. He looked at Mock, who had crept forward to touch his sister's shoulder, his small hand looking impossibly fragile against her powerful frame. And Silas knew he couldn't do it. He couldn't walk away. His fatal strength, his complete and utter inability to ignore suffering, had taken root. "My home," he said, the words feeling heavy and momentous. "It's not far, it's not much, but it's dry and warm." Gaza stared at him, her exhaustion warring with a deep, ingrained disbelief. A human, offering shelter? It was a trick. It had to be. But then she looked into his eyes, pale, tired, and utterly devoid of malice. She saw no cunning, no greed. She saw only a profound, echoing weariness that mirrored her own. She saw an outcast. She gave another terse nod. Getting them back to the shack was an ordeal. Gaza leaned heavily on Silas, his thin frame groaning under the weight of her dense muscle and armor. He was a sapling supporting a great oak. Every step was a struggle. Mock trailed behind, clutching the hem of his sister's tunic, his eyes darting into the darkening woods. Silas's home was little more than a hut, nestled on the very edge of the town's territory where the forest began to reclaim the land. The roof sagged, the walls were patched with mud and hope, and the door hung crookedly on leather hinges. To Gaza, who was used to the grand, smoky halls of her clan's mountain fortress, it must have seemed impossibly fragile. But as Silas pushed open the door and a wave of blessedly dry air washed over them, it was sanctuary. Inside, it was sparse and clean. A single cot, a small stone hearth, a rickety table with one chair. Silas helped her to the floor near the hearth, propping her against the wall. He moved with a quiet efficiency born of long practice in solitude. He stirred the embers in the hearth, adding the few branches he'd managed to gather. A small, hesitant flame flickered to life, casting dancing shadows on the walls. He brought water in a wooden bucket and tore a strip from one of his few clean shirts. He knelt and began to clean her wound. She flinched, a low growl rumbling in her chest, but she didn't stop him. The sting of the cool water was a shock, but the gentleness of his touch was more shocking still. He worked in silence, his brow furrowed in concentration. He had no salves, no elixirs. He just had clean water and a piece of his own shirt. When he was done, he wrapped the wound tightly. It was a clumsy, amateurish job, but it was done with care. Then he went to his small cupboard and took out his entire fortune, the half loaf of stale bread and 3 small potatoes. He sliced the bread and shared it out, a piece for each of them. He placed the potatoes in the embers of the fire to roast. They ate in silence. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the quiet chewing. The bread was hard, but to Gaza and Mock, it tasted like the finest feast. It was the taste of safety, the taste of a choice. Mock, his fear slowly receding, devoured his piece and then looked at Silas, a flicker of something other than terror in his eyes. Gaza watched the human. He was so small, so frail. His clothes were patched, his face was gaunt. He had given them his home, his fire, his last piece of bread. He had done it for no other reason than that they were suffering. In her world of honor, debts, and blood feuds. This simple, quiet act of compassion was a language she barely understood, but she recognized its power. They were both outcasts, trapped by circumstance. His prison was poverty and debt. Hers was exile and injury. In this tiny leaking hut, on the edge of a hostile world, they had found a moment of shared, desperate peace. The silence wasn't empty. It was filled with a fragile, unspoken understanding. A bond was forming, as quiet and persistent as the rain outside. If you believe that kindness matters more than species, go ahead and hit that like button. It helps us share more stories about unlikely heroes. Now, back to Silas's decision, because things were about to get dangerous. The first few days were a tightrope walk of tension and necessity. Garza's presence filled the small hut, her sheer size making the space feel even more cramped. She was a mountain crammed into a shoebox. She spent most of her time resting near the fire, her wounded leg propped up on a bundle of rags. Her silence was heavy, watchful. She observed Silas's every move, her warrior instincts on high alert for any sign of betrayal. Mock, however, began to thaw. He was a child, and the simple comforts of a roof and a regular, if meager, meal were a powerful balm. He would watch Silas with wide, curious eyes as the man went about his daily routines, patching his worn tunic, carving a new handle for a tool, or simply staring into the fire, lost in thought. Silas, for his part, moved around her with a careful, quiet deference. He was acutely aware of the danger he was in. Every creak of a floorboard from a passing neighbor, every distant dog bark, sent a spike of fear through him. He kept the single window shuttered tight. When he had to go out for water, he would pile firewood against the inside of the door, a flimsy barricade that was more symbolic than effective. He was hiding a secret that could get him killed, and the strain was visible in the new lines forming around his eyes. Their food situation was desperate. Silas's small cash was gone in 2 days. The hunger that was a constant, dull ache for him became a sharp, pressing threat for the three of them. On the third day, he knew he had to risk going into Oakhaven. He needed to trade the last of his carved wooden birds for flour or grain. "I'm going into the village," he announced to the quiet room. "Stay inside. Don't make a sound, no matter what you hear." Garza's eyes narrowed. "They will know," she said, her voice still rough. "They will smell us on you." It was true. Orcs had a distinct earthy scent, a mix of pine, iron, and something wild that clung to the air. Silas had scrubbed himself with harsh lye soap and cold water, but he feared she was right. "I have to try," he said. "We have to eat." He turned to leave, but her voice stopped him. "Wait." She pointed a thick finger toward the woods, in the opposite direction of the town. "There, a stream. You will find broadleaf roots along the banks, and sun nettle on the southern slope. Good food, safe." Silas paused. He knew the plants she spoke of, but had always believed them to be weeds, or even poisonous. "Are you sure?" A flicker of something, pride, perhaps, crossed her face. "My people do not starve in the forest." He trusted her. He spent the morning following her directions, his basket slowly filling with strange roots and leafy greens. It felt like another act of faith, another step across the chasm that separated their worlds. When he returned, Garza showed him how to prepare the roots, boiling them until they were soft and starchy, like potatoes. The nettles, once boiled, lost their sting and became a nutritious, if bitter, green. It was a strange meal, but it was filling. It was a meal born of her knowledge and his labor. It was a meal they had made together. As Garza's leg began to heal, her warrior's spirit chafed against the inactivity. She couldn't stand to be a burden. One morning, Silas awoke to a loud thumping sound. He rushed from his cot to see Garza, leaning heavily against the wall, using the flat of his wood axe to hammer a loose roof beam back into place. "What are you doing?" he cried, rushing forward. "You'll hurt yourself." "This house is weak," she grunted, swinging the axe again. The beam settled into its joint with a solid thud. "A strong wind will take it." She looked at the flimsy patches on the walls, the persistent drip in the corner. "It is a disgrace." For an orc whose people built fortresses of stone and ironwood, his little hovel was an insult to the very concept of shelter. Over the next week, a strange domesticity settled over them. Gaza, still limping but mobile, became the architect of the hut's renewal. Her strength was a force of nature. Beams that Silas could barely budge, she lifted into place with a grunt. She showed him how to mix a better, more durable daub for the walls using clay from the creek bed and fibrous grasses. She worked with a grim determination, the act of building a physical manifestation of her need to repay her debt to him. Silas became her assistant. He would gather the materials she directed him to find. He learned to see the forest through her eyes, not as a place of shadows and fear, but as a larder and a lumber yard. He felt a strange sense of pride as their home transformed. The roof stopped leaking. The walls were solid, keeping the damp chill at bay. The crooked door was rehung and now closed with a satisfying thud instead of a weary scrape. During this time, Mock attached himself to Silas. The man's quiet gentleness was a stark contrast to the harsh world the boy had known. Silas, who had never had a family of his own, found himself awkwardly falling into the role of a guardian. He carved a small, crude wooden wolf for the boy, its lines simple but full of character. Mock treasured it, carrying it with him everywhere. He would sit by the fire while Silas worked, and Silas would tell him simple stories his mother had told him, tales of clever foxes and foolish kings. Mock's grasp of the common tongue was limited, but he understood the kindness in the man's voice. One evening, as Silas banked the fire, Mock startled him by taking his hand. The boy's small, warm fingers wrapped around Silas's calloused ones. It was a small gesture, but it felt as solid and real as the newly repaired walls around them. But their fragile peace was not meant to last. The world outside the hut's walls had not forgotten them. Howell Critch was a man who noticed everything, especially anything that might affect his ledgers. He made his rounds monthly to collect the exorbitant rents he charged for the poor plots of land on the edge of town. Silas's was always the last stop and the most fraught with tension. One bright, cold afternoon, a sharp, authoritative knock echoed on the newly sturdy door. Silas's blood ran cold. He shot a panicked look at Gaza, who immediately scooped up Mock and melted into the darkest corner of the hut, behind a hanging blanket Silas had put up for privacy. She drew a small, wicked-looking knife, one she had clearly kept hidden, and held it at the ready. Silas took a deep breath, wiped the nervous sweat from his palms onto his trousers, and opened the door. Howell Critch stood there, a tall, gaunt man with a face as thin and sharp as a hatchet. He was dressed in immaculate dark wool, a stark contrast to the rustic poverty of his surroundings. In one hand, he carried a heavy leather-bound ledger, in the other, a silver-topped cane. His eyes, small and grey like chips of flint, immediately swept over the hut, missing nothing. "Thorn," he said, his voice dry and devoid of any warmth. "Your payment is in arrears." "Master Critch," Silas stammered, his heart hammering against his ribs, I have a little." He held out a small, pathetic pouch with a few copper coins, the result of a risky trip to sell some carvings. Critch ignored the pouch. His gaze was fixed on the roof. "Improvements," he stated, a single, damning word. He tapped a newly daubed section of the wall with his cane. "Solid, and the roofline appears stable." His eyes narrowed, flicking from the repairs to Silas's thin frame. You've been busy. Found some coin, have we? Perhaps from some undeclared labor. No, sir, Silas said quickly. Just had some time. And good weather. Critch let out a dry, rustling laugh that held no humor. Good weather doesn't raise beams, Thorn. It takes labor. Or help. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. And help costs money. Or it comes with obligations. His eyes darted toward the shuttered window, then back to Silas. He sniffed the air. A faint, almost imperceptible change crossed his face. He had smelled something. The lingering scent of sun nettle. The faint, earthy aroma that clung to the hut now. The value of this property has increased due to these unauthorized improvements, Critch declared, opening his ledger. The pages were filled with his spidery, precise script. Therefore, your rent must be adjusted to reflect its new market value. He dipped a quill into a portable inkwell and made a scratchy notation. Your debt has doubled, effective immediately. Silas felt the world drop out from under him. Doubled? He could barely pay the original amount. It was a death sentence. Master Critch, please, he begged. I can't possibly. Then you will be evicted, Critch said coolly, snapping the ledger shut. The contents of the dwelling liquidated to cover your arrears, and you will be remanded to the debtor's pit until the balance is paid. Those are the rules. He gave Silas a long, cold look. I will be back in 1 week for the full amount. I suggest you find a way to procure it. With that, he turned and walked away, his cane tapping a merciless rhythm on the hard-packed earth. Silas closed the door, his body trembling. He leaned against it, his forehead pressed to the cool wood. He had failed. He had tried to build something better, and it had only tightened the noose around his neck. Garza emerged from the shadows, her face a grim mask. She had heard everything. This man, she said, her voice a low growl. He is the chieftain here? He is the law, Silas whispered, his voice hoarse with despair. He owns the land. He owns the debts. He owns me. The weight of his hopelessness filled the small room. Garza looked around at the sturdy walls she had helped build, at the tight roof that no longer leaked. She looked at Mock, who was peeking out from behind her leg, his face clouded with worry. She looked at Silas, this small, breakable human who had saved her, now being crushed by a system she didn't understand. Her world had warlords and honor jewels. This world had ledgers and ink, weapons that killed more slowly, but just as surely. That evening, the mood in the hut was somber. The fire seemed to give off less warmth. Silas sat on his cot, staring at nothing, the magistrate's words echoing in his head. Garza watched him, her usual stoicism replaced by a troubled frown. She felt the debt she owed him growing heavier, a stone in her gut. He had taken on her burden, and now it was breaking him. She walked over and sat on the floor across from him. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. Finally, to break it, to find some anchor in the swirling sea of his fear, Silas reached into his tunic and pulled out his most treasured possession. It was a key, old, iron, and covered in a fine layer of rust. It was intricately shaped, far more complex than any key needed for the simple locks in Oakhaven. He held it in the palm of his hand, the firelight glinting off its worn surfaces. My mother gave this to me, he said, his voice barely a whisper. The day before she died, she told me it was the key to our future, that it would open a door to a better place, a home with no leaks and no debts. He gave a small, bitter laugh. It doesn't open any door I've ever found. It's just a piece of rusty metal, a broken promise. But it's all I have left of her. He held it out for Garza to see. She leaned forward, her eyes adapted for the low light of caves and mountains, studying the object with an intensity that startled him. Her brow furrowed, not in pity, but in recognition. She reached out a hesitant finger and traced the intricate pattern on the bow of the key. It was a swirling design, a knot of some kind. "This mark," she breathed, her voice filled with a strange awe. "I know this mark." From a small leather pouch at her belt, a pouch Silas had assumed held personal trinkets, she carefully extracted an object. It was not a key, but a flat circular piece of stone, dark and heavy. Etched into its surface was the exact same swirling knot pattern that was on Silas's key. "It is the mark of the first accord," she said, her eyes locked on his. "The symbol of my clan, the Stonebreakers, and the human miners of the Iron Hills, from a time long before the hatred." She looked from the stone to the key. "My chieftain, the one before the usurper, he carried the sister stone to this. He said it was a reminder of a forgotten honor, a forgotten peace." She began to tell him her story, the words tumbling out now, the dam of her silence finally breaking. She spoke of her home, a proud mountain fortress. She was the chieftain's shield sister, his most trusted warrior. But a new power had risen in the Orc clans, a bloodthirsty warlord named Thrathrak Skullrender. He preached a gospel of hate and conquest, despising the old ways of honor. He demanded tribute, slaves, and unending war against the humans. When Garza's chieftain refused, Thrathrak challenged him and killed him in a treacherous duel. He declared himself the new leader. "Thrathrak wants only blood," Garza said, her voice thick with grief and rage. "He ordered us to raid the human farms, to take children. I refused. For this, he named me traitor. He would have killed me, but I fought my way free." She gestured to Mock, "My chieftain's son. I swore to protect him. I took him and I ran." Silas listened, mesmerized. Her story was one of honor, betrayal, and a desperate flight for survival. It was the story of a warrior trying to protect the last remnant of a better world. He looked at the scared little boy, and the truth hit him. Mock was not her son. He was her prince, her sacred charge. He looked down at the rusty key in his hand, and then at the stone in hers. These were not just trinkets. They were relics of a lost age, symbols of a bond between their peoples that had been deliberately buried by centuries of war and hatred. His mother hadn't given him a useless piece of metal. She had given him a legacy. In that moment, everything shifted. They were no longer just a man and an orc hiding in a hut. They were the keepers of a shared, broken history, a chosen family bound not by blood but by a common enemy and the faint, flickering hope of a forgotten peace. The debt collector, the warlord, they were two heads of the same monster, a monster that fed on division and fear. And here, in this tiny room, holding two pieces of a puzzle they didn't understand, they had found a reason to fight back. Can you believe they did that? If you're rooting for this strange family to survive, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. Comment below. Would you have opened your door? But hold on, because Howl Critch wasn't finished yet. The week that followed was a crucible. The knowledge of the key and the stone didn't magically solve their problems. It only sharpened the edges of their desperation. The impossible debt loomed over Silas like a thunderhead, promising a storm of ruin. Every day that passed, the knot in his stomach tightened. 1 week. It was an impossibly short amount of time to conjure a fortune. Meanwhile, the threat from the woods grew more tangible. One evening, while scouting for more of the roots Garza had taught him to find, Silas saw them. 2 hulking orc scouts, clad in black iron and cruel spikes. Moving through the trees with a hunter's predatory grace, they bore the sigil of a bloody skull, Thrathrak's mark. They were sweeping the borderlands, searching, hunting. They were looking for Garza and Mock. He ran back to the hut, his heart pounding a frantic drum against his ribs. "They're here," he gasped, bursting through the door. "Thrathrak's scouts, not 2 miles from here." Garza's face became a mask of cold stone. She grabbed the haft of Silas's wood axe, testing its weight. It was a pathetic weapon against orcish steel, but it was better than nothing. We must leave, she said, her voice low and urgent. Tonight, we will go north into the high mountains. We can lose them there. And go where? Silas countered, his voice raw with panic. You're still healing. Mock can't keep up a pace like that. They'll track you down in days. He paced the small floor, his mind racing. And Critch! In 2 days he'll be back. He'll take the hut. He'll throw me in the pit. He felt trapped, caught between two closing walls. On one side, the cold, bureaucratic cruelty of Howl Critch. On the other, the hot, violent rage of Thrathrak Skull Render. Garza looked at him, her expression grim. This is my fight, Silas. It followed me here. I will not see you destroyed because of it. She straightened up, her decision made. I will lead them away. I will draw them off, and you will tell your magistrate that the orc is gone. You will be safe. No, Silas said, the word sharp and absolute. He stopped pacing and faced her. No, we don't run. Not anymore. He looked at the sturdy walls they had built together, at the small wooden wolf he had carved for Mock, at the fire burning warmly in the hearth. This was more than a hut now. It was a home, the only one he had, the only one they had. Your fight is with a warlord who despises honor. My fight is with a landlord who despises the poor. It's the same fight, Garza. They only have power because we are divided, because we are afraid. A desperate, wild plan began to form in his mind, a plan born of hopelessness and the faint glimmer of a forgotten story. He looked at the rusty key, which he now kept on a leather thong around his neck. This key, he said, his voice gaining a sliver of strength. And your stone. They mean something. They are the proof of something. Before they could strategize further, the crisis arrived ahead of schedule. It wasn't Thrathrak's scouts who came, nor was it the final day of Critch's deadline. It was Critch himself, a day early, and he was not alone. He was flanked by 2 burly town guards, their faces grim and their hands resting on the pommels of their swords. The knock on the door was not a request, it was a demand. Silas opened it to find Critch's flinty eyes staring him down. Thorn, Critch said, his voice slick with false sympathy. I have come with a proposition, an offer of mercy. He gestured vaguely toward the woods. Word has reached us. There are unsavory elements in the forest. Orcs, a war party, led by a particularly nasty specimen named Thrathrak. He paused, letting the name hang in the air. He is searching for a fugitive, a female orc, and a child. Critch's eyes bored into Silas's, and in that moment, Silas knew. He knew everything, the rumors, the scent in the air, the improvements to the hut. Critch had put it all together. He has offered a substantial reward for their capture, Critch continued, his voice dropping. A reward that would coincidentally be more than enough to clear your significant debt. He smiled, a thin, predatory slash across his face. Turn them over to me, Thorn. I will deliver them to their warlord. Your debt will be erased. You can keep this little plot of land. You will be free. The offer was a poisoned apple, safety, in exchange for a monstrous betrayal. And if I refuse? Silas asked, his voice barely audible. If you refuse, Critch said, his voice turning to ice, then you are a traitor, harboring the enemy. I will have the guards seize you for treason. I will take this hovel and its contents as forfeit, and I will find the orcs myself. They are here, aren't they, Thorn? He leaned forward, sniffing the air theatrically. Yes, I can smell the filth. From behind Silas, a low growl rumbled. Kaza stepped out of the shadows, placing herself between Silas and the door. She held the wood axe in one hand, Mock clinging to her other leg. Her face was a thundercloud of fury. Critch's eyes widened, and then a slow, triumphant smile spread across his face. Ah, there we are. The collateral. He gestured to the guards. Seize the man. Take the orcs. Be careful with the female. Thrathrak wants her alive. The guards drew their swords and moved forward. The end had come. But then Silas did something unexpected. He, the weak, unassuming man, stepped in front of Gaza. He spread his thin arms, shielding the massive orc warrior and her charge with his own frail body. "No," he said. The word was not loud, but it resonated with an iron will that made the guards pause. "You will not touch them." Critch laughed, a dry, rasping sound. "And what will you do to stop us, little man? Will you recite poetry at them?" "They are under my protection," Silas said, his voice growing stronger, louder, drawing the attention of a few nearby cottagers who had crept out to see the commotion. "This is my home. They are my family." The word hung in the air, shocking in its absurdity. Family. A human and two orcs. The onlookers murmured, their faces a mixture of fear and disbelief. "Family?" Critch sneered. "You are a fool and a traitor. Your debt is due, your life is forfeit. This charade is over." He motioned to the guards again. "Take them!" But just as the guards lunged, a new sound cut through the tension. The thunder of heavy boots. The clang of armor. From the edge of the woods emerged a dozen figures, larger and more menacing than any town guard. Thrathrak Skullrender and his warband had arrived, drawn by the confrontation. Thrathrak was a terrifying sight, a mountain of muscle and rage. His face was a roadmap of old scars, and a helmet fashioned from the skull of some great beast was perched on his head. He carried a massive, double-bladed axe. His eyes, burning with malevolent fire, scanned the scene and fixed on Gaza. "Traitor!" he bellowed, his voice a roar that shook the very leaves on the trees. "You are mine." He then looked at Critch. "And you, human," he growled. "You promised me their heads. You are failing." Critch paled, suddenly caught between his own greed and a force of pure destruction he could not control. The village square, which was just a patch of muddy ground between the hovels, became a stage for the final act. Villagers huddled in their doorways, their faces pale with terror. The guards looked nervously from Critch to Thrathrak, their bravado evaporating. It was here, in the center of this maelstrom of fear and hate, that Silas Thorne found his voice. He was no longer a weary, beaten man. He was a protector, he was a father, he was a friend. "This is not about debts and traitors," he shouted, his voice ringing with a passion no one had ever heard from him before. "This is about choices." He pointed a trembling finger at Critch. "You choose to use fear and ledgers to crush people. You choose greed over decency." Then he turned his gaze on Thrathrak. "And you choose to call honor weakness and betrayal strength. You have broken your own people's history for the sake of power." Thrathrak laughed, a brutal, ugly sound. "History is written by the strong, little man. And you are the weakest thing I have ever seen." "Am I?" Silas shot back. He reached into his shirt and pulled out the rusty key, holding it aloft. The sun glinted off the metal. "This is history. This is a promise." The key meant nothing to the humans. It was a piece of junk. But Thrathrak's eyes narrowed slightly. He recognized the craftsmanship. It was ancient, orcish. Then Gaza stepped forward, standing beside Silas. She was no longer hiding. Her limp was pronounced, but she stood tall, a warrior queen in rags. She held up the stone disc, its swirling pattern catching the light. "And this is the other half of that promise," she declared, her voice clear and strong. She looked not at Thrathrak, but at the assembled villagers. "Long ago, before the wars twisted our hearts, my clan, the Stonebreakers, and your ancestors, the miners of the Iron Hills, made a pact of peace, a pact of shared prosperity." She pointed toward the looming shape of the old, abandoned mountain that shadowed the town. "The Whisperwind Mine. You think it is empty, played out. It is not. The lower veins, rich with iron and silver, were sealed by our ancestors, sealed with a lock that requires 2 keys to open. She looked at Silas, a world of trust in her eyes. A key of human make and a key of orcish make, one to be held by each people. To open the door, we must turn them together, as partners. She held her stone disc out. Silas, understanding now, held out his iron key. He showed how the intricate shape of the keys bit was designed to fit into a corresponding slot within the pattern on the stone. They were 2 halves of a whole. A gasp went through the crowd of villagers. Old Man Hemlock, the town's eldest resident, shuffled forward, his eyes wide. "The twin keys of the mountain," he whispered, the name a fragment of a half-forgotten children's story. "My grandfather spoke of them. He said they were a myth, a fairy tale." "It is no myth," Gaza stated. "It is our shared history, a history that men like him," she jabbed a finger at Thrathrak, "want you to forget. He knows of the sealed mine. He wants its wealth for himself, to fund his wars. That is why he hunts us. Mok is the son of the chieftain who guarded this secret. I am its protector." The truth, stunning and brilliant, settled over the square. The rusty key wasn't a symbol of a broken promise. It was the symbol of a promise waiting to be renewed. The villagers looked from the key to the stone, then to the terrified but noble face of Gaza, and the small, determined human standing beside her. They looked at the mountain, which they had always seen as a barren tomb, and now saw as a treasure chest. And then they looked at Howl Critch, who had been bleeding them dry for years, and at Thrathrak, who promised them only fire and death. The choice was clear. "He's right," a voice called out from the crowd. It was the baker, a man who had always shown Silas small kindnesses. "Critch has starved us while he fills his ledger. These orcs offer a future. He offers only debt." Another voice joined in. "They stand together. Why shouldn't we?" Thrathrak roared in fury. His plan was unraveling. The humans were not cowering, they were finding their courage. "Fools, I will take the mine by force. I will burn this pathetic town to the ground." He raised his massive axe to charge, but he never took a step. A rock thrown from the crowd bounced off his helmet, then another. The villagers, armed with nothing but stones, farm tools, and a newfound, righteous anger, began to advance. They formed a wall of their own, a human wall standing with Silas and Gaza. The 2 town guards, seeing the tide turn, quietly sheathed their swords and backed away from Critch, melting into the crowd. Thrathrak was a great warrior, but he was no fool. He could slaughter a dozen of them, perhaps more. But he couldn't fight a whole town, not with his prize, Gaza, on the other side of it. He had lost. He had been defeated not by a superior army, but by a story, by a rusty key and a simple truth. With a final, hate-filled glare at Gaza, he gave a sharp command to his warband. They lowered their weapons and began a tactical, snarling retreat back into the woods. His power was built on fear and momentum. Both had been shattered here today. Now, only one villain remained. All eyes in the square turned to Howl Critch. He stood alone, his ledger clutched to his chest like a shield. His face was ashen, his composure finally broken. He was a predator who had suddenly found himself surrounded by his former prey. His system of ink and fear had been rendered powerless by a simple act of unity. The weak man had stood up for the strong orc, and in doing so, had shown everyone where the real strength lay. The aftermath of the confrontation in the square was swift and decisive. The villagers, their anger at Critch finally unleashed, surrounded him. They didn't resort to violence, their weapon was the truth. They stripped him not of his life, but of his power. The leather-bound ledger, his source of terror for so long, was taken from his hands. Old Man Hemlock, his hands trembling with age and vindication, opened it. He read aloud the impossible debts, the cruel notations, the story of a man who had profited from the misery of his neighbors. By the time he was finished, Howl Critch was no longer a magistrate. He was just a greedy, pathetic man. He was exiled from Oakhaven, forced to walk away with nothing but the clothes on his back, his silver-top cane left behind in the mud. Thrathrak's retreat was just as impactful. Word of his humiliation spread like wildfire through the Orc clans. He had been faced down by a single, wounded female, a child, a frail human, and a mob of unarmed villagers. His authority, built entirely on a reputation for brutal strength, crumbled. Warriors who had followed him out of fear began to question his leadership. Garza's clan, the Stonebreakers, saw their chance. The loyalists who had opposed Thrathrak's coup rose up. His reign of blood was short-lived, ending not in a blaze of glory, but in a quiet, ignominious coup. He was driven into the wastes, a warlord with no war to fight and no one to command. With the immediate threats gone, a new, more complex challenge began, building the future that the Twin Keys promised. A delegation, led by Silas and a now revered Garza, traveled to the entrance of the Whisperwind mine. The great stone door, sealed for centuries, was covered in moss and vines. In its center was a complex lock of iron and stone. It was a moment of incredible tension and hope. Orcs from the Stonebreaker clan, now led by a grizzled veteran who had served Garza's father, had arrived. They stood on one side, a silent, imposing group. The people of Oakhaven stood on the other. In the middle were Silas, Garza, and Mock, who clutched Silas's hand tightly. Silas inserted his rusty iron key. Garza placed her stone disc around it. Together, they turned them. There was a deep, grinding sound, the sound of ancient tumblers moving for the first time in generations. Dust rained down. Then, with a groan that seemed to come from the heart of the mountain itself, the great stone door swung inward, revealing a dark, cavernous opening from which flowed a stream of cool, clean air. The mine was real. The legend was true. That day marked the beginning of a new era. The first Accord was reborn, not as a dusty piece of history, but as a living, breathing agreement. Orcs and humans began to work side by side, clearing the upper levels of the mine. The Orcs' strength and knowledge of stonecraft combined with the humans' ingenuity and skill with engineering. They found the sealed lower veins, and they were just as rich as the legends had promised. The wealth that flowed from the mountain didn't go into a single man's ledger. It was shared. Oakhaven began to prosper. The miserable hovels were torn down and replaced with sturdy new homes, built with timber from the forest and stone from the mine. Silas's home was the first to be rebuilt. It was a community project, orcs and humans working together, raising strong walls and a solid roof that would never leak again. It was no longer a small hut, but a comfortable cottage with several rooms and a large hearth. It stood as a symbol of the new Oakhaven, a place where different didn't mean enemy. A new community began to form, one that defied the old rules. Mock, no longer a terrified refugee, was now a bridge between two worlds. He played in the village square with the human children, teaching them orcish pebble games while they taught him how to fly a kite. His laughter, once a sound Silas had never imagined, became a common and cherished music in the town. Garza, her honor restored and her people safe, chose to stay. She was offered leadership of her clan, but she deferred, appointing the old veteran in her place. "My duty is here now," she had said, looking at the new house and the town that had embraced her. She became a guardian of Oakhaven, her wisdom and strength as vital to the town's council as Silas's compassion and quiet determination. Silas was no longer the town outcast. He was a hero, a founder of the new age. But the change in his circumstances never changed the core of who he was. He remained a quiet, kind man, though the weariness in his eyes had been replaced by a deep, steady contentment. His debt was gone, but he understood a different kind of debt now. The debt of gratitude, the debt of community, the debt one owes to family. One evening, Long after the mine was running and the town was thriving, he and Gaza stood on the porch of their new home, watching the sun set behind the mountain. The air was filled with the smell of baking bread from the communal oven and the distant sound of mingled human and orcish laughter. Gaza rested a hand on his shoulder, a familiar, comfortable gesture. "You are a strange human, Silas Thorne," she said, a rare smile touching her lips. "Weakest man I have ever met, and the strongest." Silas looked at her, at this incredible warrior who had become his partner, his confidant, his family. He looked at the home they had built, at the town they had saved. He thought of the rusty key, now displayed in a place of honor above their hearth. His mother had been right after all. It was the key to a better home. It had just needed another hand to help turn it. "We did it together," he said, his voice filled with a quiet, triumphant peace. They had faced down the monsters of greed and hatred. They had proven that a family could be forged in a crucible of compassion, and that even the most broken things, a man, a warrior, a forgotten promise, could be mended and made strong again. The dampness and mold of poverty had been replaced by the warmth of a shared fire, and the fragile seed of trust had grown into a mighty tree that sheltered them all. And that is how a poor human and a desperate orc proved that family is a choice, not blood. If this story touched your heart, please smash that like button. Subscribe and turn on notifications for more stories about compassion overcoming fear. Share this with someone who needs a reminder that even a rusty key can open a future. Thanks for watching.